Welcome to Reclaim Your Life, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Duane, your host and producer. I'm the author of Alpha Chick, and I'm a life recovery coach. But I think of myself more as a spiritual warrior, helping women to live better lives. When we release the past, we can fully embrace the present. All of my guests this season will share their own journeys of self-discovery, how they pushed through their fear and pain with perseverance, and now live as self-loving, empowered women with a purpose. We have a great show for you today. I am so honored to introduce to you Cheryl Hunter. Besides the fact that she's drop-dead gorgeous, Cheryl is a best-selling author of the book Use It, Turn Setbacks into Success. She's a speaker and a high-performance expert who specializes in providing Fortune 100 caliber coaching for individuals, schools, and businesses. Cheryl was drawn to her work as a result of her own journey. She was abducted as a teenager. That life-altering experience ignited a strong desire to contribute to others. So distilling the methods Cheryl used to turn around her own life, she developed an educational model to help turn around results for people in all contexts. Cheryl became a woman with a mission to empower people to fulfill their highest potential. In service of that mission, Cheryl has coached and led programs to over 93,000 people since 1995. Cheryl's a noted media personality. She has made great impact with her highly regarded TED Talks, and she's a regular contributor to the Huffington Post, CNN, Forbes Magazine, U.S. News, World and More, and U.S. News, World and Report, and so many more. Cheryl, welcome, welcome, welcome.
I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, you have such a powerful, powerful story to share with us today, and I'd love to start that conversation with a little snippet I took out of your best-selling book, because I think it's going to give our listeners just a huge feeling of what Cheryl Hunter is all about. I'm not this girl lying on a gravel-covered floor with a demonic man-wolf on top of her, tearing her to shreds. I'm just a shimmering speck of light that can fly away any time I choose. When I read that in your book, it gripped me because I knew that's how you survived. And I'd love for you to share your journey and how you did survive what you've been through.
Thank you. I would love to, which is a kind of interesting place to arrive at, because one of the steps originally that I used to survive early on, I was a teenager, and I thought, well, I just can't tell anybody. And so it's a real transformation to be able to speak about it freely, to be an adult now. I'm from a little mountain town in Colorado. I grew up on a horse ranch, and it was so remote that there were no buildings visible from our ranch, other than our own barn and home. You couldn't see anything. I mean, way off in the distance. At nighttime, I could press my face up against my window, and the side of, if I were at the very side of the wall in my bedroom, and I could lean against the wall in the window and see specks of, like, the tiniest flashes of lights on the freeway headed to Walsenburg, Colorado, which, there's not too many lights going there either. And I thought, oh, those people, they're going places. They were at least literally going someplace. And the place that had been my haven became, as a teenager, it seemed more like a prison to be that far away from other people. So I concocted a plan to move somewhere, anywhere. And I thought, well, I'd read a Glamour magazine for career advice. And thought, well, I could be a model. Nobody would argue with me that I can't do that in my little town in Colorado. I'll go, I don't know, someplace they need models. And I thought, well, Europe always sounded captivating. How alluring that sounds. So I saved up all my money and, had a few jobs, worked as a lifeguard and, all sorts of things. At a pool and just odd jobs. And my best friend and I took off for Europe. And no sooner did we land in France than a man with a camera around his neck came up and, big, beautiful camera. It means something, right? And he asked me if I was a model. What are the chances, right? Mm. And I thought, I just stood there mouth agape like, it's that easy? That's how easy it is to become a model in France? Holy mackerel. You walk out here and they ask you. And he said I could be one if I just were to go off with him and his friend. And my friend said, absolutely no way over my dead body. The guy gives me the creep. And frankly, I agreed with her that he did. But I thought, well, if I don't do this, I don't know anybody else. I'll be forced to go back to Colorado. I'm smart. I'll figure it out. Well, I didn't. I went with them and they drugged me and took me to an abandoned construction site where they held me for days and beat me and raped me and finally dumped me in a park in Nice. But during that time, that excerpt you read from the book, there was this, it was dark in there and just the sound of rustling plastic was all I heard. I didn't know if it was day or night at any time, but I remember at one point that was particularly difficult. I craned my head as far as I could to the right just to pretend it wasn't happening. If I could not see it, then, just some coping mechanism. I'm not going to look. And then, therefore, I'll just pretend it's not happening. And I craned my head as far as I could to the right, and I saw this little speck of light, and I had no idea where it was coming from, but I realized that whatever was making that little dancing speck of light on the wall, it was free. And I stared at it with all my might. And, kind of still in the mind of a child. I was 18 when they took me. I was 19 when they brought me back. But I was still, a child for all intents and purposes. And I thought, if I stared at it hard enough, I could become that speck of light. And I really felt like I was it. I was that. I was not this body. And I'd heard these spiritual truths from my mother. She was very into yoga. She taught yoga when I was a kid and was very into all things spiritual. And I'd heard things like we're not the flesh, we're not the body, we are what transcends, with all that. But those are just concepts. And I thought, wait, I'm not this body. I'm not this pain. I'm not this circumstance that I'm going through. I'm something else. I'm something eternal, like that light. And it really was something that I'm sure pulled me through that time. And then when I left, I was back in reality, and I thought, what do I do? We're never educated on how do you survive something that seems unsurvivable. What do you do when your whole world is, askew, upside down? You don't recognize it or yourself anymore. An incident like that really changes who we are forever. And I thought, well, if I tell anybody what happened, a natural response is to ask for help, to talk, particularly at that age, ask for help or talk to someone. And I thought, if I tell people, they'll know that I am unable to take care of myself. They'll know that I am now filthy and rotten and damaged and used up. They'll know that I'm stupid and gullible. And then on top of all that, I'll have to go back to our ranch, in Rye, between Rye and Senegal, Colorado, hidden in the middle of nowhere and rot there forevermore with these horrible thoughts in my head. No, I decided I can't tell anybody. And frankly, I didn't. For almost 2 decades. I mean, no one, not my sister, not my mother. I coped by becoming initially very distant from people, and then finally funny or witty or, just things that would keep me at arm's length from people, never really opening up anything. So it's kind of new territory now talking.
Ooh, amazing. What inspired you to start to talk about this, to start to free yourself, to start to create that model of turning this in to this incredible success that you experience today?
Well, there was initially, I was trying to I had this image when I was dreaming. I used to dream that I was underwater and I could see light and I was trying to swim up to it. Or I could fly, but I was like a bird trapped inside and I couldn't get through the ceiling out into the air. I kept dreaming about getting to air and needed oxygen, but I wasn't there yet. So I would, if anyone told me about a book, I would read any and every book on personal development. I took every seminar and course on that. I studied with different coaches. I went to therapy. Absolutely anything I could get my hands on. I was trying to get oxygen. And eventually I was taking personal development seminars, and I just found myself, it seemed like I was filled with such light and levity and hope and a sense of what's possible when I was there, as opposed to every place else in my life. And everybody else around me that was participating, it seemed to be the same experience. So I thought, well, maybe I'll just train to lead these. It seems like a natural progression. I loved them so much. Well, I could just try that. And the more I did, I just kept moving forward, putting one foot in front of the other. And then I eventually started leading these seminars and personal growth and development, and the people that traffic in that sphere also trafficked in the professional growth and development. So I started going into companies and doing transformational work there, like culture change type thing, which is basically changing like it is to change an individual. You're just changing from one sphere to another, more productive, better, more yourself, more of what you envision. And finally, I was leading a course for individuals, and we were discussing forgiveness, and I was saying that one could forgive anything. And there was a woman that stood up to the microphone to interact with me who disagreed. She'd been through horrors that most of us could never imagine. She'd moved from a country where there was genocide and women were viewed as property, and her husband had physically and sexually abused her and her children. And she said there's no forgetting certain things. And everyone in the room or many in the room were agreeing with her. And I kept standing for, no, you can forgive. Not even for him, but for her well-being. And people were milling about in the back of the room and slamming things down, and a couple of people got up and left, and I thought, uh-oh, the room is going to turn. The way that we normally believe is, in some regard, even in a setting like that, an eye for an eye. If we demand blood for blood. If someone does something that horrific, we demand that justice be served. And I'm not disagreeing with that justice can be served, and people can't act like that in normal society. They can't. However, justice, quote unquote, never brings forgiveness. It never brings peace, really. It never brings internal resolution. And I was telling her that she had the opportunity to provide those for herself. But at this point, it was still hypothetical. And I could sense the room was about to turn. There were a couple hundred people in there. And I thought, it's time. It's time. That my story can't be just the impetus for me to provide this for people, but something hidden that I still, in the mind of a teenager, think is damaging to share. No, it needs to be shared. And I told my story for the first time. And I noticed myself, I was crying, but not for that I was still wounded by it, but rather the release of it. And I said everything there was to say, and you could have heard a pin drop. And this woman then burst into tears because she could now see that it was, in fact, possible for her to forgive as a part of her own journey, as what was holding back the healing for her, as something that would make every bit of difference in her life and the lives of her children. And I went home and woke up my mother and told my mother. And she had known something. She actually said that. After I was dumped in the park in Nice, I ran to in those days you couldn't make phone calls, like there were no cell phones. You didn't just like dial an international number. You had to go to an Amex office or the post office. And I ran to the post office and I dialed my mother and I waited, and there were a bank of phones along the wall. Usually you've got a private phone booth, but in Nice there was just a bank of phones along the wall, and I stood there and my mom answered, and it was in the middle of the night in Colorado, and she said, hello, and I said, I'm okay. And at that moment, the mastermind of the two, walked up and leaned against the wall and saw me and said, what are you doing? And I just hung up and pretended I had a wrong number. But my mom said, you had called me in the middle of the night to tell me you were okay. I knew that meant you weren't. So all these years later, I told my mom, and then I told my sister, and I waited years then to tell my dad and my brother. I saw that there was still some healing and processing to go through, and I eventually told them all. But I realized that it was essential to talk.
In that 20-year window, had you really come to a place of forgiveness?
I have.
Why? So you all along you were processing something within yourself that created that feeling of forgiveness towards the men that violated you.
I was doing courses of all kinds, and that was obviously initially the only thing I brought in there. Mm-hmm. Someone at one point had suggested that in one of these seminars that I had done, that we're responsible for it all. And I thought, you horrible man, how dare you even assert that I could be responsible for this horrible thing that happened. And I was going to get up and walk out myself. And then I thought, well, let me just sit here for a second. I paid good money. I'm here. I'm spending my time. I do need to get to oxygen, as I felt, So let me just try on this stupid thing he's saying. And they said, can you find at least one piece that you could be responsible for? And I realized, well, yes. I knew this man was bad news. He gave me the creeps, and I went anyway. And in the moment that I was able to seize responsibility for something, the whole thing started to unravel. And that gave me a real surge of power. And I was able to forgive. And I developed some exercises along the way that made it easier. Mm-hmm. Because at first it seemed impossible. I thought it was a badge of honor that I would never forgive. How dare I forgive? But it was holding me back. I could see it was the lock on my own freedom.
How did you break through that? What specifically did you do?
At first it seemed unimaginable to forgive, but like I said, my mother was into spiritual things, and I read some of those books and on forgiveness processes, and they seemed too much of a leap for me. And I realized that there was a step that was necessary first. You know, I'd love to be my highest expressed soul, but I realized that first I'm a human being who's experienced a violation. And as a human being, I needed to get that stuff out. And I wasn't doing it to anybody else. I wasn't speaking to anybody else. I wasn't, I didn't even want to tell my therapist, if you can believe that. I just talked about things. I eventually spoke about a rape, but it didn't really get there. But I realized that there was a litany of things that were in my head that I needed to get out. So I created an exercise, and I now do it with clients who've got anything that they want to move through or get through difficulties with someone in their life, even if it's just like conflict in their marriage. But I call it the person-to-person process. And you create a safe space and do a process where you concoct an image of the other person in front of you, and sometimes people feel more comfortable asking for permission of that person, not literally, but, sort of in a prayerful type mode. And just sit in silence and get out everything you want to say. And, as evolved people on a path of enlightenment, we don't usually say, "You are a horrible person. How dare you?" We would never say that kind of thing. We instead swallow it, hold it down, and I'm not advocating ever saying those things in real life, but the construct of getting out absolutely everything to an imaginary them, it unleashed it was like the floodgates open. And I just kept doing it and doing it and doing it until I realized I had nothing more to say. And at that point, I could get to some of the more evolved processes, but I certainly couldn't get there from the violation. I couldn't get there from a violated state, leap up to being a soul, and I forgive you. It was impossible. I needed something as an interim, something as a bridge.
Mm. And I love that idea of sitting in what's a safe space for you, envisioning that person, saying everything you need to say, unloading, getting it all out, just that clearing process so that, you can move forward, come up to another level and a different vibration about the whole thing by getting all of that out.
Right.
Mm. You do a lot of coaching now and helping people. What do you feel are some of the best steps or suggestions you could give somebody today that is in that state of pain, is in a state of suffering, maybe not from something as horrific as what you experienced, but could be, as you said, marital problems, relationship problems, conflict at work. What do you recommend for your clients?
Well, first of all, I one of the things I firmly believe is that we have to acknowledge when there's been a trauma or a violation, and not name it a particular way. I was on a call, it happened to have been yesterday, with a client who, as a child, an adult did something completely inappropriate with them. And she said, well, it was just a surface violation, she'd said. And I think she probably said that knowing my own story, not wanting it to sound like, oh, it was that type of a violation. And I stopped her because it's so essential to realize a violation or a wounding or a trauma for any of us, it doesn't have to look any particular way. Someone could wound you with their words. A violation could happen with a glance. It's imperative, I think, to recognize when something's not okay with us and to nurture ourselves and care for ourselves and heal ourselves that in a way that's commensurate. And I don't mean commensurate with was my whole family executed or did someone tell me I'm an awful person. It's commensurate with having been wounded. I think if we try to say, well, mine wasn't as bad as somebody else's, that invalidates us, and that sweet inner one that's at the core of us feels like we can't be trusted then with ourselves to not recognize what happened. And I think it's essential to first do that, recognize that something has happened that's just not okay and that it's wounding, and allow yourself to mourn that, to recognize it, to mark it. And then look at where authentically you are. Are you still, depending on how recent it was, are you still hurting because of it? Is it still impacting you in the present? Did it leave its mark in a way that scars you now? Each one of us we're trying to do the best we can. And we are part of our own human design. We create compensatory mechanisms based on what's happened to ensure that we're never hurt like that again. The problem is we don't recognize that we've got those compensatory mechanisms in place. So one thing that ends up happening, and it's beyond our level of seeing, we don't recognize it, is that we keep dragging around those past experiences with us in the present. So we oftentimes experience like we keep having the hurt now. Mm-hmm. We keep having those impediments now. We keep having to survive now, even though what we survived may have been some time ago. So I think it's essential to go back there. Obviously I can't walk through the whole thing right now, but just as an overview, go back there into that moment that you were hurt or wounded, and we've all experienced a lot of those incidents, and bring understanding and love and healing and acknowledgement of those wounds to ourselves. And even that, going back to each of those fundamental incidents, can help us move forward into the present without carrying around that fundamental wounding. And it leaves us, going through that process, it leaves us being present in the present rather than reactive in the present. It's very liberating.
Beautiful. You have a wonderful free gift for our listeners, and thank you for being so kind. And tell us a little bit about that. I'm very excited about it.
Well, thank you. I realized that in my book, Use It, Turn Setbacks into Success, I chronicle how I moved out of that difficult state and into a...
Welcome to Reclaim Your Life, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm Duane, your host and producer. I'm the author of Alpha Chick, and I'm a life recovery coach. But I think of myself more as a spiritual warrior, helping women to live better lives. When we release the past, we can fully embrace the present. All of my guests this season will share their own journeys of self-discovery, how they pushed through their fear and pain with perseverance, and now live as self-loving, empowered women with a purpose. We have a great show for you today. I am so honored to introduce to you Cheryl Hunter. Besides